Do you know anyone who's currently at the UN who is involved with child sex abuse?
Yes, I think most people that work at the UN do. Within the UN, child sex abuse is seen as a cost of doing business. French peacekeepers were abusing children in the Central African Republic. So children as young as 8 years old were being forced to give jobs in exchange for food. That is despicable. That is the opposite of what the UN is supposed to be doing. Everyone that's been involved in these cover-ups, whether of child sex abuse, without exception, has been promoted. Everyone that has reported it, that has tried to stop it, has been fired or has resigned. So basically, I told my boss, well, if you hand this name to China, her children will be tortured. He handed the name to China. Several months later, Amnesty International issued an urgent action regarding the torture of her children. The UN has spent more than $3 million on silencing me. People leading the investigation appointed by the WHO had very close relationships with the laboratory in Wuhan and effectively were too willing to accept constraints from the Chinese authorities on what they should and shouldn't look at. The UN's position on whistleblowing, whether it's this, child sex abuse or anything, is destroy the whistleblower. My name's Reilly. I worked for the United Nations for 10 years. My job was to try to stop human rights abuses from happening around the world. I'd have myself locked up in prison cells with violent criminals in some of the worst places on earth in order to find out the truth about what was really going on behind closed doors. But when I unearthed the fact that the United Nations itself had devolved into one of the most corrupt organisations on the planet, and when I exposed their complicity in the biggest genocide since the Holocaust, instead of doing anything about it, they've come after me with everything they've got. I've even found government spyware on my phone. My emails are being hacked. And I've lost count of how many journalists they've bought out who are about to tell my story. There's a reason people haven't heard about this. The information I have could spell the end of an era for the United Nations, and they know it. Xinjiang now has the largest network of concentration camps since the Nazis. We haven't seen this kind of organised, state-run genocide on this scale. And the UN is on the side of the oppressor. I was trying to stop UN complicity in that. Criminal complicity in an ongoing genocide. And instead of taking any action about my actual reports, the UN saw me as the problem for raising the issue. And they have gone to extreme lengths to try to shut me up. The UN has spent more than $3 million on silencing me. They approached my lawyer and offered me a huge sum of money to go away if I would sign a non-disclosure agreement. They sent armed police to my home when I was going to speak at a UN meeting about this. They have defamed me. They've tried to generate false complaints about me. Basically, the UN's approach to any internal problem is go after the whistleblower as hard as they can, make sure nobody ever listens to that person. What's unique in my case is that the UN actually fired me for the act of whistleblowing. In previous whistleblower cases, they've always accused them of something else. So, either they've been violent, they had performance issues, some other thing. I'm the only person they've ever fired specifically because I told the truth to member states and to the press. I was literally charged with trying to change a policy of the Secretary General. Guilty as charged. The Secretary General's policy is to hand names to China, and I am trying to change that policy. I was charged with making public things known to me as a result of my functions. Again, guilty as charged. What's interesting is the UN actually claims in court that this is a public policy that everyone knows about. So how exactly have I been fired for making it public? My direct boss, the chief of the Human Rights Council branch, a guy called Eric Tistune, had been passing names of dissidents who were planning to engage with UN human rights mechanisms to the Chinese government. And my immediate reaction was, of course, we should never hand over this information. It is fairly widely known that China uses intimidation and arbitrary arrest, detention, torture, even killing family members to stop people speaking out. And we'd always refused that information for every other member state. I said, okay, I'll send them the standard response saying we don't give that information. And the reaction of my colleague, who had been working with NGOs in the UN for years, was that I should discuss with my boss. So that was already quite terrifying. And then when I had that discussion with my boss, it was really clear that his view was that we should just give over the names because it would mean an easier life. Now, we aren't talking about some theoretical danger that I was raising, that, oh, China might use this information in a bad way. We're talking about a specific instance of one of the names on the list that we already know what China does when they know that she's going to speak out. So Rebiya Kadeer, for example, she's a really well-known Uyghur activist. It was already public knowledge at that point that several years previously, her adult children had been tortured in front of each other. The phone was then handed to her daughter, who was being forced to also witness this torture. And she was forced to call her mother in the US to listen to her own children being tortured live and being told not to go to the meeting she was planning to go to. So basically, I told my boss, well, if you hand this name to China, her children will be tortured. He handed the name to China. Several months later, Amnesty International issued an urgent action regarding the torture of her children. Now, the UN claims it can see no link there. I gave them the example of Gao Shisheng being tortured to stop his family members speaking out. I gave the example of Dulcan Issa, whose entire family has been detained in concentration camps. Both his parents died in concentration camps. And still, the UN says, this policy's fine, there's no problem.
How long has this been going on for?
This has been going on for years, at least since 2006. Every single meeting of the Human Rights Council, China has been handed names of exactly who is planning to speak out. And it was in September 2013 that I think I got the proof, essentially again, that what I was saying, I wasn't some kind of mad woman, that this is really dangerous. Every 4 years, the Human Rights Council considers the human rights record of specific countries, and China was up. And a group of people were travelling from China to attend the Human Rights Council. And they were arrested at the airport. And they were placed in arbitrary detention. They weren't allowed to travel to Geneva. One of them, Cao Shin-li, died 6 months later in detention, having been denied medical care. And I do not know whether or not her name was handed to China by the UN. The UN doesn't know that either. They've never conducted an investigation. But it does show the danger of which I was warning, that danger is very real. China will go to extreme lengths to stop its human rights record being criticised. It will particularly go to extreme lengths to stop its human rights record being criticised in a room with Chinese diplomats in it. Those facts are well known. There should have, at that point, been an inquiry. At that point, the UN should have admitted, yeah, maybe telling them in advance who's coming is a bad idea. As I said, whether or not her name was on that list. And what has happened subsequently is that the UN has tried to make this entire argument about whether her specific name was on the list. So they've ignored the fact that I can prove that Rebiya Kadeer's name was handed over and her children were tortured. That I can prove that He Geng's name was handed over and her husband was tortured. I can prove Dulcan Issa's name was handed over and his family members were forced to denounce his actions and sort of forced TV confessions. I can show people whose families were arbitrarily detained. I can show that people were placed in concentration camps as a result of the names being handed over. But the UN only discusses that one issue. And what's been disappointing is kind of seeing how what I would term the human rights industrial complex works. That while individuals, when I speak to them about this, are concerned, no major NGO has actually come out and announced this. Even the NGOs that you would sort of expect to be a little concerned. So, for example, the NGO to whose training Cao Shin-li was planning to travel is an organisation called the International Service for Human Rights. And when I was placed under investigation by the UN and charged with wrongdoing for having told the truth in public, the UN had to give me all of the evidence of what I was accused of. And that evidence was basically that when I brought this up, sometimes they had to have meetings or write letters. And they lied in those meetings and letters. But I called the head of that organisation and just sort of say, hang on, you've been telling the press that her name wasn't on any list. How do you know that? And I was basically treated to a 15-minute verbal tirade about how I was somehow defaming Kaushan Lee's memory by daring to suggest that her name might have been handed over. I don't know if her name was on a list or not. I'm saying that somebody should investigate whether or not it was. And somebody should investigate whose names were handed over and what exactly happened to their families. And you see it externally as well. No NGO wants to know either. This doesn't fit the narrative. And I've given the evidence to all of the major human rights NGOs, but there is something, a revolving door with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which pays about 3 times as much as the average NGO salary. So people do tend to want to get a job there. So criticising the UN is not going to be helpful for their personal career development, so they don't do it.
Could that be why this hasn't gone mainstream news? Like, why isn't this front page news?
There's a general unwillingness to criticise the UN. Sometimes it's been because the UN has offered a bigger scoop. So sometimes when I have been in contact with a journalist, that journalist has suddenly gone silent and a couple of weeks later has a major UN scoop. It has actually been covered in some relatively mainstream press, but the thing is it gets covered once and then forgotten about. It's seen as some kind of side story rather than something fundamental. I think the same way as people don't really understand what the European Union is and how it operates, the same is true of the UN. It's several layers removed. If this was the British government handing names to the Chinese government, it would be front page news everywhere. But because it's the United Nations, nobody sort of sees where the responsibility lies. It's this kind of faceless bureaucracy that's doing something bad, but people feel powerless to stop it. When I first told my colleagues what was happening, when I first went to people in other departments and told them, hey, they're handing names to China over here, like this must stop. By the end of it, when I was bringing it up with a colleague whose function within the UN was to integrate human rights into peacekeeping operations, she basically looked at me like I was the most naive person on earth and said, well, it's a job like any other. I mean, China's the paymaster. What did you expect? As I said, her job is to integrate human rights into peacekeeping. That is her literal job description, and that is her view.
What did she mean by China are the paymasters?
China is now the second largest contributor to the UN budget, and there's a kind of fiction that democratic member states have whereby somehow the UN is independent and we shouldn't interfere in what it does with the money. So the money that comes from the US and the European Union all comes basically no strings attached. That is not the case for the money that comes from China and other totalitarian regimes. They put a lot of pressure on individual staff members to do their bidding. And a lot of those individual staff members will do that. And it was telling that the justification given by my boss for handing names to China was otherwise it would exacerbate Chinese mistrust against us. When he discussed it with Le Monde newspaper, he talked about a sort of pro-con analysis. But for him, the only pros and cons he could see were the ones that directly affected him and the smooth running of his meeting. So he talked about the pro of handing names secretly to China being that China wouldn't ask in public, and the con being that, well, you know, China might ask in public for who was coming. That would be China obeying the rule. The rule, if you want to know who is coming to a UN meeting and you're a member state and you want to know if a particular individual is coming from an NGO, is that you must ask in front of other member states so that they can object and stop you getting the information. The rule is not that the Secretariat should sit there quietly handing over names to China. And I mean, it would be the same for any member state. Like, you know, on the same rationale, should we give North Korea the names? Should we give Eritrea the names? Is there any state that the UN would think we shouldn't give names to?
Who are the people that China wants the names of that the UN is giving to them? What kind of people are they?
The kind of people China's asking about are really varied. Simply being a member of an ethnic minority is enough. So if you are Uyghur, Tibetan, outside China, they want to know. If you've spoken at any kind of event. So everything, you know, and it includes students, interns, as well as people that are quite high profile and heading up NGOs. Relatives of high profile detainees in China. So relatives of human rights lawyers who are detained who have managed to get out of the country. It includes academics that work on China. It includes some academics that are still based in China. Most of the people on the list actually have nationality of other countries. They are of Chinese origin, but they're citizens of other countries. And this should be a consular issue for those countries. But again, even when I reported it to them, there's this kind of collective not wanting to know.
This is actually my next question is, you know, are there citizens of other countries on that list? And if so, could you talk about that?
Sure. I've contacted most of the countries that are democracies and kind of have strong human rights records that their citizens are on the list. That list includes the US, the UK, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, Australia, Canada, and a few others. Most of the ambassadors of those countries simply ignored my report. I'm not aware of any action having been taken. When I've subsequently had contact with some of the people where I have informed their government that their names were being handed to the Chinese government, they hadn't even been told. It's very difficult often for me to have any kind of secure contact with these people. That, you know, I would literally be resorting to Googling them. And I know that China does monitor my communications, so I don't want to place them in danger. So I informed their governments, but they basically didn't do anything about it.
What was the response from the UK when you spoke to them about some of their citizens?
The UK has refused to meet me. I've requested several meetings with the UK ambassador in Geneva and others. The UK has refused to meet me, but what is interesting is that in the evidence that was given to me by the UN, it showed that the UK did raise the issue over a beer with the spokesperson of the Human Rights Council. So a junior staff member at the same level as me who was not actually involved in this process and has publicly lied about it. He said no names were ever handed over and got very offended by the question when a journalist asked him. And in his interview with investigators that led to him being fired, he basically showed off that he had managed to stop the UK being worried by telling them that I was mad. So rather than look at the written evidence, the UK government decided to have a beer with a friend and ignore their own citizen coming to them with written evidence of wrongdoing at the UN that endangered the lives of UK citizens and their families.
Why is China getting special treatment then?
Power. China has power. China exercises that power. I don't know what the initial interest was. I think this probably did genuinely start in 2006 as an act of misconduct by an individual staff member. But since then, every single senior manager has got behind it. China is a major donor. Chinese diplomats get a lot of information on people. Sometimes it's probably compromat. Other times it's probably financial. I'm not sure what the exact motivations of individuals are. I think, to be honest, in the case of my boss, I think it was genuinely just he wanted an easy life. And it was easier for him to just hand over the names, and he just didn't care about the consequences. He didn't think about them.
So China basically give over a huge amount of money under the kind of condition that you do what they say.
Effectively, yeah. And a lot of that money that China gives has conditionalities attached that aren't made public. So China gives a lot of money, for example, to development assistance, and particularly to the least developing countries and small island developing states. Now, a lot of that money is conditioned on having diplomatic relations with China. So you've seen a lot of small islands in the last few years cutting diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Otherwise, they can't access UN funds.
Could you talk about, is there a difference in the way, for example, the United States gives money to the UN, for refugee camps, for the FAO, for this, and the way that Beijing or the way the Chinese government donate to the UN?
The ways that different member states give money to the UN is very different. So for most of the democracies, they stick with the fiction that the UN is wonderfully independent and will do the right thing with the cash. So they give money that's called unearmarked. China does not do that. China gives earmarked funds that usually reflect some Chinese interest. So the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, will be largely funded through Chinese money. I think that one really telling fund it's called the Peace and Development Fund. And it's basically a slush fund for the Secretary General. And China gives 20 million a year. And it is jointly decided with the Secretary General what's that spent on. So the Secretary General can hire his preferred people, can put his pet projects in it, and China clearly thinks it's getting its money's worth there. And it really shocked me when I met Antonio Guterres in person. He was in Geneva in February 2020 and for the Human Rights Council. And a colleague had given me his actual direct email. So I emailed him and said, would you be available to meet? And to his credit, he actually agreed to meet me. He's one of the very few senior managers to have done that. And we met in Geneva airport. And I told him, I reported this. Names are being handed to China. He was completely aware. I said, I'm being subjected to retaliation for reporting this. Like, I currently have no functions. Can you at least give me a job and we can have this fight, but, from a fair system where I'm getting work? And he basically said, well, most people in the UN would dream of having no work. So he knows the organisation he's running. He basically told me that he was tired. He only wanted to deal with the Security Council. He didn't want to deal with managing the organisation. And that other member states had put all these senior managers in place and he couldn't control them. And we had some follow-up emails and it was really depressing. He said he would see what he could do with the people in charge. Now, if the Secretary General isn't the person in charge of the United Nations Secretariat, exactly who is? Who is he having to check with to shunt a junior staff member sideways while there's an ongoing court case, while I'm trying to stop them doing this? And he made really clear that he didn't care about names being handed to China. He just didn't care. When I met with Antonio Guterres, he admitted that he knows I'm telling the truth. I implored him to make some public statement. I implored him to at least let the Uyghurs whose names are being handed over know if this is continuing or not. To be honest about the risks people are taking when they're engaging with the UN so that they know and can, take informed decisions about their own lives and the lives of their family members. He said it would be difficult. And the difficulty for him was entirely a political one. I think for him, everything is a political bargaining chip, including human rights. Everything is about getting what he wants to be his legacy. He wants his legacy to be climate change. For climate change to be his legacy, he feels he needs China's support in exchange for non-binding agreements that there's no chance China will actually stick to. He's willing to overlook a major breach of international law that goes against the founding purposes of the United Nations. It's no coincidence that I was fired in the week of the COP conference. I've been speaking out about this for 9 years. My contract was renewed 4 times. What changed? So I'm I think it's fairly safe to say that I was part of a deal between Antonio Guterres and the Chinese government to sign on.
Yeah, so that basically, in exchange for the UN keeping you silent and firing you, that China will non-legally binding agree to shut down some power plants or something.
Yeah. Basically, you sign on to a non-legally binding agreement on climate change and you get one free genocide. Human rights are seen as an obstacle generally in the UN, whether it's at headquarters or in the fields. When I was in Mauritania and one of my roles there was to sort of contribute to it's called the UNDAF, it's like the plan of the UN for the next year. And every other UN agency was really trying to water down human rights. Same thing for the Sustainable Development Goals. I actually, in the last 6 months of that, was leading the Human Rights Office advocacy, just because I happened to have a maths degree as well, and we were at the stage of discussing what we were going to measure. And again, every other UN agency just wanted human rights out of there because they're awkward. Member states don't like them. It stops good cooperation with the member states. I mean, human rights are legal rights that can only be used by an individual against a government when the government has done something wrong. Fundamentally, if you're working in human rights and the government's like you, you're doing it wrong. And human rights are meant to be one of the 3 pillars of the UN, but they just aren't. I mean, the first time the words United Nations were used was during World War II. It was a declaration by the Allies where they referred to themselves as the United Nations. It was very much a sort of project that came out of that, the idea of freedom from fear and want, that there were certain rights that everyone had by virtue of being a human being. The idea that, and again, it's in the preamble to the Charter, the idea that twice in our lifetimes we have seen the scourge of war, the references to genocide. And the UN was supposed to be the organisation that would make sure this couldn't happen again. The League of Nations had failed. World War II had happened. We're going to try again, but better this time. And this time we'll do it right. This time we'll make sure that this cannot happen again. And it is happening again. Instead of it being Jewish people marched into camps, now it's Uyghur people. And the world is just standing by and watching and prioritising its economic relationship with China above all else. And the body that was founded on the idea that at least here we will have some moral authority, here they will speak out, is silent. There has been absolute silence from Antonio Guterres, from Michelle Bachelet, from all of the people who are supposed to speak about this. Occasionally an independent UN expert has made a statement, but the UN as such is silent. I think the fundamental problem in the United Nations is that the senior managers are so devoid of ethics that they don't understand what having ethics would look like. So instead of engaging with me on the issues I'm reporting and doing anything to try to either stop handing names to China or give me some kind of evidence that they might be considering stopping it, they've always tried to effectively buy me off. When I first approached the ethics office, I was told, instead of coming to us and asking for protection, you should use the information to get your boss to give you a promotion elsewhere. Effectively, get a pay rise out of it instead of doing anything about it. Then they said that they would give me many years' salary if I would go away and sign a non-disclosure agreement. At every turn, it has been about personal benefit to me. They simply cannot conceive of the possibility that someone might actually value the lives and safety of an entire people over their personal pay and benefits. And those are the people running the UN.
How has this experience made you look at the things that unfolded during World War II with the Holocaust of the Jews and other minorities? Has this informed your view of what like you said, plausible deniability, and he said, she said, and not wanting to do anything about it and ignoring things that led to evil prospering? Has this experience informed the way you look at history and other genocides?
Yeah, and I think not just the Holocaust, but also the other genocides. Rwanda, where the UN has its share of responsibility. Srebrenica. There's a wonderful quote, not to get too esoteric, from Dante that informed a lot of my human rights work. The deepest court of hell is reserved for those who in times of great moral crisis sit by and do nothing. That pretty much sums up my philosophy about human rights. That for human rights abuses to thrive, it requires good people to do nothing.
Yeah. Do you see some similarities also between what's happening now in Xinjiang and what happened during World War II? Are there?
Of course. Xinjiang now has the largest network of concentration camps since the Nazis. We haven't seen this kind of organised, state-run genocide on this scale in years. There's a reason why the organisations that are shouting the loudest are the Jewish organisations. We're heading down a very dangerous path, and the birth rates speak for themselves. They are sterilising an entire people. And the world is basically sitting by and watching it happen. And the UN is silent. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has not made a single statement about this. The Secretary General has not made a single statement about this. The only statements out of the UN have been the odd expert that might say something. But they have refused the pleas of the Uyghurs to speak out. And they have refused even to tell the Uyghurs whether or not they're still handing their names to China. They have asked.
Could you tell me about the Uyghur Muslims, their plight, the concentration camps? Try and give a big picture view for people who have no idea who they are or what's going on.
The Uyghur minority is based in Xinjiang in China, which is a very mineral-rich area, and an area that the Chinese government very much wants to exploit. China does not have the greatest of records with any ethnic or religious minority, and have taken a similar approach to the Uyghur Muslims as they took, for example, to Tibet. So there has been wide-scale destruction of all cultural sites. Mosques have been razed, burial sites have been razed. The Chinese government places what they call cousins in the families of Uyghurs. These are basically Chinese spies that report back on whether or not they're religiously observant. They will do things like try to encourage people to drink alcohol, eat pork. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you have a strange man that is sleeping in a bed with a Uyghur woman, sexual violence ensues. In recent years, the repression has ramped up. China has constructed the largest network of concentration camps that has been seen since the Nazis. There is widespread forced labour in those camps. There are reports of insufficient food, widespread systematic torture, systematic rape, including having Han Chinese pay for the privilege to come in and rape women who are tied to beds. They can select which of the women they would like to rape. There are very large-scale sterilisation efforts of the women who are detained, either IUDs or more often surgical. The children where both parents are detained are sent to orphanages where they are basically required to denounce their culture, to sing the praises of the Chinese government again, destruction of any cultural tradition, destruction of any link between sort of parents and children. Just, as I said, on a scale that has not been seen since the Holocaust, and disturbingly, it seems that the world is willing to just sit by and watch it happen.
Do you want to talk a bit more about the concentration camps? Because there's been a number of satellite images that have come out, and I don't know if you're aware of this or if you're even comfortable talking about it, but I heard they're now starting to build them underground to avoid the satellite images.
Yeah.
So could you talk about the concentration camps, the scale that they're operating at, how fast they're growing, and then the underground thing?
Yeah. The scale is impressive. I mean, estimates are that between 1 and 3 million Uyghurs are detained. Because a lot of satellite imagery has been employed to prove the extent of the camps, there have been various other methods used. Some of the camps seem to have larger underground sections being constructed. In other cases, China has moved on from the camp regime to placing people in prisons. So a sort of transition from a labour camp directly into prison for, offences such as being Muslim. And there's been a significant movement in that direction of sort of criminalisation, and where questions are asked internationally about specific individuals, those individuals will then be given a lengthy prison sentence. A lot of people have disappeared into this system. Their whereabouts are unknown. Their families have no contact with them. Family members based outside China can't have any contact with their families still in China, because such contact is now a reason to be placed in a concentration camp. A lot of Uyghurs are also forced to denounce any Uyghurs outside of Xinjiang who may speak up. Family members of Dolkanisa, for example, have been forced to testify on camera that he's lying, that it's all untrue. Similarly, for most of those whose names appear in China's lists, for the Uyghurs whose names are on China's lists that the UN has handed over their names, their entire extended families are now in concentration camps.
Talk about the kind of torture that they're enduring.
There are various things like tiger chairs, where people are sort of held in positions, stress positions for long periods of time. There's deprivation of food, deprivation of sleep, regular beatings. A lot of torture, and sort of having worked with a lot of torture victims, people report the psychological torture is the worst. The not knowing what's happening to your families. The hearing the screams of others being tortured is often reported as being almost worse than being tortured yourself. People are forced to participate in the torture of others. For example, particularly when it comes to the mass rapes, some Uyghur women are forced to tie others to beds to prepare them to be raped by Han Chinese men who pay for the privilege. And that's one of the ways of breaking down those kind of societal bonds and breaking down communities, is the forced participation in torture of others. Watching the torture of close family members or close friends. Again, that's something that most victims report as being almost worse than being subjected to torture yourself. I mean, it's just horrific. It's almost anything that you can imagine has been reported as happening in these camps. Also, the significant evidence of organ harvesting. That's something that the Chinese government uses already, sort of widely known on members of Falun Gong and people sentenced to death, is forced organ harvesting, and there is evidence that that is happening also in the camps. And it's a hell of a euphemism, but you take out most organs and the person dies. So it's state-sanctioned murder. What China has made the Xinjiang region, Orwell would be proud. There is surveillance everywhere, and there's significant complicity of companies based in the global north in this. There's facial recognition cameras basically everywhere. Your every movement is tracked. They specifically look for Uyghur faces. They're designed to look for Uyghur faces. The surveillance includes majority Chinese citizens coming and living in your house and reporting back on a regular basis. The your mobile phones are tracked just systematically. Every move is tracked. Everything every Uyghur does is tracked. Any indication that they're sort of approaching a mosque, that they haven't eaten pork, they haven't drunk alcohol, that they might be observing Ramadan, all of that is tracked and is used for almost a social capital score. And if you fall below a certain level, you will be put in a camp for re-education.
Could you, can you talk about the slavery that's going on? Is there slave labour going on with the Uyghurs? I've heard things about the women selling, like the hair being taken. I've heard about COVID masks being made in these camps.
Yeah. Slave labour is happening in the Xinjiang region. These concentration camps are used as sources of slave labour. A lot of Western companies are benefiting from that. 80% of the world's cotton is produced in Xinjiang. Companies like Zara, Nike, most major brands are profiting from that. Some of them have even advertised it to their Chinese market. So Hugo Boss has advertised using Xinjiang cotton. Muji advertises using Xinjiang cotton. Volkswagen has a factory that's basically in one of the camps, which, given their history, you would have thought might have caused them to think twice. There's also forcible transfer of Uyghurs to other regions in China. So if you are buying anything that is made in China, the chances are that it could well be tainted by slave labour. One of the things that was reported earlier in the camps is that women are having their hair forcibly cut. So natural hair wigs being sold in the global north are actually forcibly removed hair from women who are being held in concentration camps. And there's a huge responsibility on the part of governments in the global north that are allowing these products in. Sourcing of tomatoes as well. A lot of the tomatoes that are sold in Europe as being Italian are processed in Italy, but the tomatoes are grown in Xinjiang and picked with people using slave labour.
Specifically, why is the Chinese government doing this? What are they hoping to achieve with this genocide?
The destruction of the Uyghur people. The Chinese government is aiming to destroy the Uyghur people. That's the definition of genocide. The actions that they are taking fulfill the definition of genocide. The people writing the Genocide Convention were the victims of the Holocaust. They knew what they were doing. They didn't require that the population be being incinerated in order to start to say it was a genocide. They put the bar slightly before that point. So they said preventing births in a group, which China is doing, systematically subjecting people to torture, which China is doing. Those also constitute genocide. Removing the children of a population, which again, were both parents in a concentration camp, China is doing. The aim is the destruction of the Uyghur people. They're taking what they did in Tibet, which the international community let them away with, and they're basically putting it on steroids and applying it in Xinjiang.
You mentioned that the removing of children. Like, is there like forced abortions as well, or is that?
In some cases, it's not even a forced abortion. It's killing the child immediately after birth, where the pregnancy has gone on for long enough that the child is viable. Sometimes the forced abortion results in a live birth and the child is killed.
How important is the Xinjiang region for the Belt and Road Initiative?
Oh, it's essential. And the Belt and Road Initiative is China's big development effort. And the current High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, was the Latin American contact for the Belt and Road Initiative when she was president of Chile. So she is very committed to Belt and Road, and her country's economy depends on China. And as High Commissioner, of course, she's now agreed to never meet with any dissidents that China does not want her to meet with. There are many communications from the Chinese government thanking Ms. Bachelet and her predecessor, Prince Said, for never meeting with Uyghur, Tibetan, Taiwanese, Hong Kong activists. It's policy, it has been policy for years. They simply don't do it. They aren't willing to annoy China. And as I said, human rights are rights that can only be used by individuals against governments. So if a totalitarian regime that is committing genocide likes you, you might be doing that wrong. Similarly, Antonio Guterres, very committed to Belt and Road. His peace and development, 20 million a year slush fund from China, is all about Belt and Road. In terms of natural resources, Xinjiang is incredibly rich. It's really at the crux of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's where everything gets transported through. China desperately needs to hang on to Xinjiang. China could not afford to have the Uyghur independence movement be successful. It's an incredibly rich region in terms of coal, in terms of oil and gas, in terms of cotton, in terms of natural resources, wind energy, renewables. It's all there. So part of its effort in this genocide is to very quickly shift the demographics. So, for example, now Tibet is majority Han Chinese, and the aim is to make the Uyghur region the same. So if you look at the birth rates, the areas that are majority Uyghur have plummeting birth rates, and the mixed areas are plummeting less. There's a very much targeted demographic change, and they want that happening quickly.
It feels like much of the world still doesn't know about this issue, and the ones that have heard about it, hearing an article or two, struggle to really comprehend the gravity of it and believe that it's really true and that it's really happening.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? And repeat back a little bit of that.
I think a lot of the reason why people struggle to sort of believe it's happening is the idea of never again. Surely if this were happening, we would be paying more attention. And part of that is the sort of lack of access. You know, it's very difficult to get into Xinjiang. Some incredibly brave people who are based there have gone around with cameras filming where the concentration camps are, verifying those satellite images. But anyone that actually tries to travel the region is tailed by Chinese police, is forced back. You know, you can go in and have a kind of Potemkin village tour, but that's it. Anyone who speaks out outside China knows that if they dare to speak, their families will be targeted. Some of them incredibly bravely choose to take that decision for the sort of greater good, but the heartbreak that that entails. There's also just the misinformation campaigns. One of the other things my boss allowed to happen in the UN was for China outside the Human Rights Council to have an exhibit on happy people in Xinjiang. All of those exhibits during the Human Rights Council have to be approved by the UN Secretariat. He approved that one. The rule is nothing on a country during the Human Rights Council, but he allowed there to be that exhibit. Again, another way of intimidating Uyghurs who are thinking of speaking out into silence. Even in the halls of the UN, China controls the information. I mean, it's a very small example, and I'm a very small fish in this, but every time I tweet anything, the number of Chinese bots that kind of come out of the woodwork to say, no, it's not true. There's no genocide in Xinjiang. It's all a myth. China employs useful idiots in the global north to go around and say that there is no such thing. There's a real campaign of making sure that there's just enough disinformation for people not to be sure.
Doubt is their product. It's kind of the tobacco industry did the same thing.
Yeah.
Have you tried to sue the UN? And could you repeat the question back?
Nobody can sue the UN. The UN has diplomatic immunity. Everyone that works for the UN has diplomatic immunity. When I worked at the UN, I had diplomatic immunity. The UN was supposed to set up a way of suing it in 1946, but apparently they've been very busy since and never quite got around to that. So the only court that this can ever be looked at in is an internal employment court in the UN. The Uyghurs whose names are handed over can't sue the UN for placing their families in danger. The only place that the UN can be sued on this is me taking them to court over the way they've treated me as a result of reporting it. But what happens then is that the UN tells all the member states, well, look, it's an employment issue. It's not an employment issue, it's complicity in genocide. Complicity in genocide is not and never will be an employment issue. The UN can only be taken to its internal court, so I did. I have several court cases against them. In the first court case I had against the UN, it was found that the Secretary General himself, and in person, not the organisation, had unilaterally taken a decision not to apply UN rules in my case. The UN didn't like that judgment very much, so they got rid of the judge. He was about to rule in 2 other cases where he would have revealed in public the UN's actual court position, which is names are handed to China, names continue to be handed to China. I am unreasonable to think that is a problem when every senior manager knows and has done nothing. They literally fired the judge from one day to the next. He had written his judgments. The UN had seen the content of those judgments. He was told by a UN staff member not to come to work the next day.
So rather than let the justice be served, and they went to the extent to fire the judge who was going to potentially give you the winning case and change things. That doesn't happen often, does it?
It's the act of a totalitarian state. It does occasionally happen in countries like China, Eritrea, North Korea.
But this is in the UN that they're doing this.
This is the UN. Rule of law is something in the UN that I worked on a lot, and I was advocating with member states to implement systems where nobody was above the law, where judges had fixed terms, where there wasn't any interference, etc., etc. None of that applies internally. Under Antonio Guterres, the UN is run, frankly, more like a totalitarian regime than a system with the rule of law. And I think if most people knew that, they would be horrified. But because there isn't any external oversight, because nobody actually understands how the UN operates, people just assume it must be doing a good job. We must be the good guys.
Could you talk about the growing influence that China has over different departments of the UN and why that is potentially problematic?
Sure. I think there's always a focus on Chinese nationals leading an organisation. I think that what I reported shows that it isn't necessary for there to be Chinese nationals. It's just necessary for there to be influence of the Chinese Communist Party. The issue is that there's a sort of dual loyalty. If you know that if you displease the Chinese Communist Party, you or your family could be arrested, then you may not be entirely loyal to the principles of the United Nations that you're meant to be upholding. And I think that any Chinese official that is the head of a UN organisation must have the constant fear that if they don't do as the Chinese Communist Party tells them, they could face the same fate as the former head of Interpol. He was on a trip to China in 2018 and was effectively kidnapped. The last message he sent to his wife was an emoticon of a knife, and she hasn't heard from him since. And he now languishes in a Chinese prison, and the member states that elected him to that post have basically done nothing about it. So the message is clear. If you're a Chinese head of a UN organisation, you'd better do what the Chinese Communist Party wants, or you will pay the price.
Do you have anything to say about COVID and its outbreak and the investigation by the WHO and China's willingness to cooperate on that?
The WHO, like most UN agencies, is quite beholden to China. China sends regular note verbale saying whether or not Taiwan will get to participate this time, warning other UN agencies not to engage with any Taiwanese authorities, and Taiwan was excluded from the WHO on the instructions of China, which certainly legally doesn't seem something China should have the right to do.
The WHO considered Taiwan's membership. Hello? With the
I'm sorry, I can't hear. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah. Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
What happened with the coronavirus outbreak and the investigation that the WHO led?
The WHO-led investigation was completely biased from the outset. The people leading the investigation appointed by the WHO had very close relationships with the laboratory in Wuhan that certainly was one of the potential sources of the virus. They certainly didn't do, I think even the head of the WHO has now admitted that they did not look closely enough at the potential of a lab outbreak, and effectively were too willing to accept constraints from the Chinese authorities on what they should and shouldn't look at.
So it's not out of the question then that there could be a cover-up with the coronavirus outbreak, which the UN WHO was part of.
It certainly isn't out of the question, and I have been contacted by someone who is currently authoring a report about COVID for another UN agency who is seeking advice on how to blow the whistle, which I think speaks for itself.
So you are connected to someone who could blow the whistle on an expose regarding the coronavirus outbreak?
Yes.
And China's involvement and the WHO's involvement? It's
a different agency.
Okay, a different UN agency,
yeah,
which could be involved with China in covering it up.
Certainly, Chinese edits are being accepted in a report regarding the coronavirus.
Is there any more you can share about this currently?
No, but I have suggested that the man like to be in touch with you.
I'll take that too. When you first were about to work for the UN, or as you were starting to work for the UN, did you at the time believe that it was a great organisation that wasn't corrupt in it, or wasn't majorly corrupt? Is that what you believed?
Yeah, when I first started working for the United Nations, I thought that most of my colleagues would be like me. Would be there because they wanted to affect fundamental change in the world, because they believed fundamentally in human rights, and yeah, I was working for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I thought that we would all be on the same page.
Was that not the reality?
No. Very early it became clear that it was a lot more political. Obviously I'd expected some politics, but the idea is that human rights laws are supposed to be kind of the be-all and end-all. You can't breach those. They're the ultimate source of international law. There aren't circumstances in which it suddenly becomes okay to torture someone. And what I was seeing was a lot of compromise happening about, and it started with things like the contents of reports would be changed because a particular state was upset. And then I realised that it was actually much worse than that. There's a fundamental part of the UN Charter that says that if you work for the UN, you effectively forget everything else, that your entire loyalty is to the Charter. So you don't think about kind of what your nationality is or what other governments might want you to do, that you just work to implement the UN Charter. And it was very clear that very few colleagues were actually doing that. And it was much more about pleasing specific powerful member states in order to advance one's own career. I think I realised everything wasn't as it seemed relatively early on. One of my other roles in the UN was actually to work to the sort of back end of recruitment. And I basically realised that every single post was sewn up in advance. And that these deals were being done between people. You know, there's a rule in the UN that you can't hire your own children. So what they did was they hired other people's kids and did these kind of diagonals. So, you know, my boss hired the daughter of the head of the International Labour Organization, and he hired his daughter. And it was just that kind of level of nepotism. The question that you get asked when you join the UN is kind of, where did you work and who got you your job, basically. And I was one of a very few that had genuinely just applied online when the job announcement came out and got it.
How?
I later found out what had happened was that even for the UN, the attempted sort of recruitment on that post was so bad that the High Commissioner had intervened. So what had happened is that my boss, Eric Tistone, had put up a single name. So there are 30,000 applicants for this post. And he says there is one qualified applicant and sends up that name to the High Commissioner. And she sent it back down and said, please, at least interview a few people off the roster. So as I said, I was on that roster and they interviewed 8 people off the roster. And then they put his name first, of course, and me as a second choice. She then reversed the order. So it was a complete accident from the UN's perspective that I ended up employed there. But I think that's actually a story that's quite common to whistleblowers. The people who end up entering the UN, whose loyalty genuinely is to the Charter and not to whoever got their job, tend to be the ones that report the corruption in the perhaps slightly naive belief that member states might care. So basically, we're the unicorns. We're the ones that didn't know anybody, got our jobs just by applying. And we're the ones that blow the whistle. We're the ones that go external and say something is very, very wrong. Because there is this incredible motivation for people who are in the UN to keep that job. It is very well paying. Free private education for your children up to the age of 25. Free medical insurance, private, anywhere in the world at any time. It is ridiculously lucrative. You don't pay tax. You have diplomatic immunity. It's a very cushy gig. The UN, especially at the highest levels, the wages are ridiculous. They're higher than most sort of prime ministers earn in the world. And people want to get their friends in. So they design jobs so that they can hire their friends. Jobs are regularly rewritten so that the girlfriend, whoever is writing the job, can get it. It is just a level of corruption that is unbelievable. And it's just accepted at the highest levels. When I reported it, I went to the head of human resources and said, hey, because I assumed it was just in my department. And I was like, well, in the Human Rights Council branch, every single job is sewn up in advance. Like, literally, they're telling us who's getting the job at the end of it. We've got all these people applying, all these people going through interviews for nothing. And I was basically told that because I wasn't an applicant for the job, I had no legal standing to complain about it, and therefore Human Resources didn't care. The UN Ethics Office is supposed to protect whistleblowers. So at the moment when I was declared to be a whistleblower in July 2020, they were meant to take action to protect me. It was meant to be an investigation, people were meant to be held responsible. None of that happened. Instead, the UN investigated me for whistleblowing and fired me for whistleblowing. Firing someone is the ultimate act of retaliation in an employment relationship. So I wrote to the UN Ethics Office and asked them to fulfil their mandate and protect me as a whistleblower. And they wrote back and said that they don't deal with members of the public. So all you have to do in the UN, if you want to retaliate against a whistleblower, is fire them immediately. The reason for the culture of silence at the UN is twofold. First of all, there's an actual rule. Very Kafkaesque, verging on Orwellian, but there is a rule in the UN that you are not allowed to say anything public that could make the UN look bad. Doesn't matter if what you're saying is true. You just shouldn't mention anything that could make the UN look bad. And you can be fired if you break that rule. The second reason is something called the noble merit principle. And that's the idea that the UN should be the most attractive civil service to work for. So we're paid like the Americans. We have the social services of the Swedish. Every advantage is there. Free private education for your children until they reach the age of 25 anywhere in the world. Flights back home every few years. If you're working somewhere even vaguely dangerous, you get sort of rest and recuperation days. The salaries are crazy. And nobody's actually expecting you to do much work for that salary. In fact, doing work is actively kind of discouraged in some areas. Certainly they didn't want me to be trying to protect the human rights of the NGOs participating in the council. They'd much rather that I just went along with the paper pushing.
So the people that are meant to be in charge of essentially human rights for the world don't give a shit about human rights.
Yeah.
It's just a cushy job that the relative that they're part of some, I don't know, aristocratic family got them into?
A lot of the time, yeah. I mean, a lot is made of the sort of geographic balance within the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But I mean, how diverse is a system where almost everyone is the child of an ambassador? Is that really the diversity that we're looking for? Most people have this really positive view of the United Nations. I mean, Antonio Guterres is effectively some kind of secular pope. We're the good guys. My title was UN Human Rights Officer, and I think even within the UN, a lot of people kind of assume that because they're doing it, it's therefore the right thing, just because they have that title and the way people view them. But, I mean, the reality on the ground of UN missions is that there's a lot of conflict with local populations. So you've got these populations that are supposed to be the beneficiaries of all of this wonderful UN action, who are objecting to the way that is being carried out. Within the UN, child sex abuse is seen as a cost of doing business. Instead of setting up systems to actually stop the abuse, we now have this victims commissioner that's there to kind of effectively provide some form of compensation to victims of sexual exploitation and abuse by UN civilian forces, civilian staff or UN peacekeepers. And it's things like, we're sorry our staff raped you, but have a sewing machine. And we'll train you to use this. In Haiti, the UN brought cholera and cited diplomatic immunity to never be held responsible for that. Diplomatic immunity is cited in cases of child sex abuse. People are not arrested by the local authorities. The UN does these kind of internal investigations which are designed to be ineffective. I mean, there was a big scandal a few years ago about sex abuse in the Central African Republic. The investigators that they sent in took DNA samples to prove that children had been fathered by peacekeepers. They then stored those DNA samples in metal filing cabinets in non-air conditioned rooms for 6 months. Now, I'm no biologist, but even I can tell you that there's nothing that's going to survive that. There's going to be no usable DNA. They lost track of the kids. Every time the UN says, well, we can't find any of these victims of abuse. 2 journalists go in and can find you 50 in a day. There's no effort to find the victims of the UN's abuses. And it's in everyone's interest to close their eyes. Prostitution increases every time there's a UN mission nearby. Survival prostitution is not something the UN should be encouraging, and yet there it is. There's huge amounts of cover-ups when anything goes wrong, because you're dealing a lot of the time with areas where the UN are really the only ones on the ground. So a lot of times even national embassies aren't there, but the UN still is. So there's not really anyone looking and seeing what's happening. For a multi-billion-dollar organisation, you don't have any external oversight at all. Everything relies on the UN self-reporting. And member states only really get true information when a whistleblower comes forward, but every whistleblower who comes forward knows they are going to be fired. And again, it's a cushy number. A lot of people choose not to know. And it's very easy within the UN to decide that you're not going to see things. So another whistleblower in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was a man called Anders Compass, who was the head of the department basically dealing with member states and field offices. And he became aware that French peacekeepers were abusing children in the Central African Republic. So children as young as 8 years old were being forced to give blowjobs in exchange for food. That is despicable. That is the opposite of what the UN is supposed to be doing. He was disgusted. So he did exactly what you should do. A crime is being committed by French peacekeepers. So he told the French, because they have jurisdiction to charge those peacekeepers. He gave them the names of the children and the names of the individuals who were abusing the children so that they could take criminal action against those people. And he was suspended for that. He was marched out of his office by UN security. He was treated like a pariah. And it was another whistleblower, a woman called Miranda Brown, who blew the whistle on how he was being treated, that eventually managed to force investigation of his treatment. And that investigation found that the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Said, who led retaliation against me, had gone against Andrews Compass with a single-minded determination that his only concern had been to shut up the whistleblower, not to protect the children. And years later, 2 years after he was completely vindicated, but had still resigned from the UN because, of course, the UN never apologised, a journalist contacted the UN. And the response of Rupert Colville, the same spokesperson who regularly abuses me to the press, was that Andrews Compass was the shittiest person he'd ever worked with. He was duplicitous, despicable, in bed with the French. That's how the UN discusses whistleblowers. And for journalists who get that kind of statement from an organisation that's meant to be diplomatic, they assume something's there and their lawyers won't touch the story. Everyone that's been involved in these cover-ups, whether of child sex abuse, without exception, has been promoted. Everyone that has reported it, that has tried to stop it, has been fired or has resigned.
Do you know anyone who's currently at the UN who is involved with child sex abuse?
Yes, I think most people that work at the UN do. In my case, an Assistant Secretary General, which is like, the way the UN works is there's a Secretary General who's an individual, the Deputy Secretary General who's an individual, then you have Under Secretary General, then Assistant Secretary General. So fourth highest post in the UN. He told me that he is aware of people working under him who are sexually abusing children. He would not give me enough information to enable me to properly report that. I did report that he had told me that, but no action was taken. And he said specifically that because he has seen how I have been treated for doing the right thing and reporting wrongdoing, he is too scared to. He's the fourth highest person, at the fourth highest level in the entire organisation. I'm one level up from the bottom. And the way I've been treated terrifies him to that degree. I mean, first of all, the UN maybe needs to start looking for staff with a bit more of a moral backbone, but it just shows the degree to which the problem is the person who speaks up. And the reported cases of abuse by UN peacekeepers are the tip of the iceberg. There's no accountability. Everyone has diplomatic immunity. Nobody's held responsible for anything. And there's a culture of looking the other way and not wanting to know, because if you knew, you could be held responsible if the shit does hit the fan.
This Assistant Secretary General is not speaking out about someone he knows who is raping multiple children because he's worried he's going to lose his job.
Yeah.
What's his name?